Perfect. So for those of you who don't know me, as Johanna said, my name is Dave Kassan. I am the Graduate Research Support Administrator in UCD Assessment. So the first part of the masterclass will be about a 30-minute presentation given by myself, followed by a Q&A session for another 20-25 minutes thereafter by my colleague Mary Bush. And as Johanna said, Fiona French, our colleague, will be acting as questions. She'll be gathering the questions in the Zoom chat, so you can get typing any questions you might have now or during the session. You can get typing into the Zoom chat, and Fiona will gather them for the Q&A session, which will happen straight after this presentation. So just before we get started into the presentation proper, I just want to, I suppose, outline a few acknowledgements and express my thanks to there's been various inputters on this eThesis exam system before myself for the eThig project came on board. So in particular, I'd like to thank our late colleague Elizabeth Pearce, first of all, who would have laid a lot of groundwork and foundations on the eThesis exam system to get it up on its feet. Secondly, I'd also like to thank Mary Bush, who has been an encyclopedia and an engine rolled into one when it comes to the eThesis system. So her, length and breadth of her knowledge has been proven invaluable in getting the legs going on the eThesis exam system. I'm also very grateful for the input and the enthusiasm and the contribution of the eThesis implementation group, who've all been very instrumental in getting the suite of resources and supports that we now have available for all stakeholders, which I'll go into in a bit more detail later in the presentation. I'd also like to thank the library staff, in particular Joseph Green and Anne Conway, who oversee the research repository database as well, which tethers itself to the eThesis exam system, and that's an invaluable resource. And I'd also like to thank EAG, who have provided us ongoing support for maintaining the system, and not to mention building the system in the first place. So there's a lot of people to thank, a lot of contributions from many different areas. So we're all very grateful for that. So to get into the presentation proper, it'll start with an introduction and go around the reasons for the change, why develop an eThesis system in the first place. And then after that, we'll give a more high-level overview of the eThesis exam journey. It does involve several stakeholders ranging from, students, supervisors, exam committee members, ACC committee members. So there's a lot of different stakeholders, and we're hoping to provide you with I suppose, more of an insight into where you fit into the whole process and who does what and when. We'll also direct you to the useful information, our FAQ guides and our eThesis guidebooks, and our dedicated email as well. So I'll bring that to your attention towards the end of the session, and then I'll hand over to Mary and Fiona for the Q&A session afterwards. So the reasons for change. So the eThesis exam system was developed to facilitate online processing of research thesis. So not just from initial submission, but it also encapsulates the examination process and the ACC decision-making, which then resulted in the students being conferred with an award. There was several difficulties we felt that the stakeholders were facing with the paper submission. First of all, there was no formalized password protection. Obtaining signatures on the examiner's reports was difficult, as people would have to be in the vicinity of each other in order to get the required signatures, or they'd have to be posted off to each other. There was a confusion over exactly what was required in the final thesis report, and it was a bit of back and forth going to get it right. There was time taken for postage and delivery of softbound thesis as well. There was also practical issues as well, that like the cost of printing out softbound copies for students and to have them posted off to the various exam committee members is quite costly. There's limited data available for reporting, and therefore continuous improvement was very difficult to maintain. And there was no certainty over whether the version of the thesis being examined was indeed the final version that was then submitted to the university. So there was a bit of a gap there as well. There was very little transparency as well on thesis tracking for staff and students. So it was that bit harder to know where the student's thesis was or what stage it was at in the process. Conversely, the eThesis system has addressed many of these issues. So it's much more in line with GDPR data protection. It has a secure login feature. It's been informed by academic regulations and is compliant with academic regulations. There's faster turnaround times, as I'll show you in one of our stat slides later on. It's just that bit quicker to get sorted. The electronic sign-off in the system means that, you know, exam committee members don't have to be within the vicinity of each other. This potentially can be done anywhere in the world, and a lot of this examination process can now, in theory, be done anywhere in the world. They don't have to be on campus in UCD, for example. There's also key outlines of approval workflow and the key decision points throughout the process. The practical benefits as well of that: it's cheaper for students, it's less costly, it's better for the environment, there's less paper being, you know, printed, so more trees are being saved. The thesis can be tracked better throughout the examination process by all stakeholders more accurately, thanks to the eThesis system. Reporting is also easier with recording of steps within the system, and also it links in with the use of the open access research depository. So, you know, once the student gets their award and after their embargo is lifted, anyone can access their research materials from anywhere in the world. So it does allow for a greater dissemination of academic research amongst all the academic communities. It also aligns with UCD's digital technology strategy and UCD's overall strategy of working towards being a global university. This eThesis system very much caters for that. So stats time now. These stats are just to outline how much the pendulum has swung in favor of the eThesis in the last couple of years. In 2019, there was about 20% of all our thesis submissions, and that's from all research degree types, like including like not just level 9s, but also level 10s, that it was about 20% of the eThesis were submissions in 2019. Whereas in 2020, almost 85% of our submissions were for 2019. Now, the eThesis has also been vital during the difficulties we faced during the pandemic, and that has definitely accelerated the development of the eThesis project. But the eThesis project at the same time has been conceptualized and has been set up since before the pandemic, and will certainly be here long after the pandemic is gone as well, and we'll be making solid use of it. But the figures show that it is being heavily used and that it is still business as usual for the college in terms of, you know, examining and awarding, giving awards for research theses. This is the amounts that we've had come in through of the amount of students that have submitted in the last couple of years. So in 2019, there was just 90 students used the eThesis system, whereas 268 in 2020. We're already at matched 2019 figures, and it's only Pancake Tuesday, so we predict that that figure will increase exponentially throughout 2021. The turnaround time, as I mentioned, is a good bit quicker as well. So the average duration from the time student submits to the time they're given an award approval that's processed on our system. For the paper submission version, it took about 8 months on average, whereas at the moment for the eThesis, it's 5 months. So 3 months faster on average. So that's a win-win for everybody involved. Now onto the eThesis journey itself. So this is the journey of who does what and when, and who fits in, where you fit in into this project. So I'm going to be referring back to this timeline several times throughout this project. And as Johanna said at the start as well, like everyone will get these slides afterwards as well. So there's a bit of information here, and it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but don't worry too much about trying to take in everything that's on this particular slide, as you'll be able to digest it at your own leisure after the presentation. So we're going to start off with the phase 1 of the eThesis journey, which is the thesis submission phase, which would involve the student, the supervisor, and the graduate research board working to get prerequisites for uploading the thesis. So program compliance and thesis embargo are important elements for getting prepared in advance of the thesis submission. They're approved by the graduate research board, who meet monthly. So it's very wise to have these approved at least 1 month prior to submission. So it's very important for the supervisors to have that conversation with their students as to whether or not a thesis embargo is appropriate. It's important to have that lined up like well in advance of submission. that conversation shouldn't need to be happening around the time of submission. They'd want to have that chat in advance, and if they do believe it appropriate, they should contact their school or the graduate research board in order to, I suppose, speak about the rationale for giving that embargo. The graduate research board also oversees program compliance, which can hinder the student uploading their thesis as well. So it's good for the supervisors and schools and the GRB to work together to make sure the students' program compliance is complete. So once that's set in place, the supervisor can look and review over the thesis separate from the eThesis system. So the student and the supervisor can have that conversation separate to see which one they agree on uploading. And then once that's sorted, the supervisor can go on to InfoHub and go into My Thesis and Supervisors and click the blue button, the Allow Thesis Upload button. Now, it's important for the supervisor first to click where you see the exam committee button, where the red arrow, because the supervisor will need to check if the exam committee members match and are correct. And they are indeed the exam committee members assigned to examine the student's thesis. But once the supervisor checks that the exam committee members are okay, they can click the blue button to allow the thesis upload. And a common theme of this particular system is that once you click one of these blue buttons, it tends to pass the torch on to the next stakeholder so that they can complete their tasks. So there's a lot of passing of the baton or passing of the torch between it. And that's signified by these automatic emails. So once the supervisor clicks the Allow Thesis Upload, the student will receive an automatic email informing them that the supervisor has permitted them to upload their thesis. So there's a lot of prerequisites and prep work as well that the student should do in order to successfully be able to upload their thesis to the system. They'll need to have a current registration on the research program, and they'll also need to make sure their fees are up to date. So if they have any trouble around that, they should contact the student desk via the student desk connector. Students should also check in the thesis submission section if their name and address are current and up to date on our system. So they can click the check address, click here icon near the red arrow, and they can check that their address is up to date and that there are appropriate capital letters in the addresses as well. Like, so there's a capital letters for the country and for the city and town and county, because all of that will have a bearing on their transcript and their degree parchment and their conferring as well. So they'll need to make sure that that's up to date. They'll also need to make sure that their names are correct, like that there's no typo in their name, or if they want to change their name, like use their maiden name or their married name, for example, they can make those changes in that click here section. They'll just, for changing their name, they'll need to contact the student desk and present them with a valid form of ID, such as a passport, for example. Another thing that supervisors and students should be aware of is that the system will only accept one PDF file at a time. So the student will need to ensure that their entire thesis, the thesis content, their appendices, any accompanying material will all need to be combined and saved into one PDF file. So that will need to be done if it's to be successfully uploaded. Another thing I forgot to mention about the supervisors is that the supervisors in advance of this will need to have done a plagiarism check as well to ensure that everything checks out in that regard. So once all those prerequisites are in place, the status should change, as you see here on the screen, written in the green writing. The student should see "You may submit your thesis for examination," and that blue "Submit Thesis" button should appear. So once they click into that, the student clicks into that, it'll take them to a page to ensure that their thesis title is up to date on a system and correct. So they can check that thesis title there. And once that checks out, they're then brought to this upload and submit form. So it's essentially an online form which they fill out, and then they can attach the appropriate eThesis file to the system. As you can see, there are mandatory fields for this form. So the student will need to include their abstract. They'll also have to put in 4 keywords. They'll need to, when appropriate, they'll need to put in their ORCID ID or their Open Researcher and Contributor ID. And obviously then the eThesis PDF file itself. A thing to note on the abstract, and this goes for most of these text boxes on the forms, is they have a character limit. So a common issue we might have is that it exceeds the character limit. So when they try to submit the thesis, they'll get an unexpected error has occurred, would pop up on the screen. And that's usually because the abstract is too big for the text box. So there is a character limit there that is listed, but there's also what's called a bytes limit as well. There's they are often the same, but not necessarily the same. It depends on if there's any special characters or certain special characters being used. So we have a link to a bytes counter in this presentation as well that you can use once you're given the slides. So if you're unsure about whether or not the character limit or the bytes limit has been exceeded, you can use that link the student can use that link to copy and paste their abstract into the bytes counter. Another thing to note about the thesis file is students sometimes try to put their thesis title into the file, or that they try to put too much information into the file name, and that the file name itself is too long. That'll also be met with an error message. So we'd recommend, just their name, student number, and the date that they're going to upload it, and whether it's a master's or a PhD, for example, just to keep it as small and as concise as possible. So once all that checks out, once they've done all that, the student can hit the submit thesis button, and that essentially finishes the first phase of the thesis submission phase, which is basically the student, the supervisor, and the graduate research board working in concert to, I suppose, get the prerequisites in place for the submission system. So the next phase it moves on to encompasses the supervisor completing the final checks before approving the thesis for upload by the students. So when the student uploads their thesis, as previously mentioned, the supervisor will receive an automatic email. So the torch will be passed over to the supervisor now for them to complete their task. So they'll be able to review the thesis that's been uploaded and then either approve it or reject it, depending on the situation. So the supervisor can go into the approve submitted thesis section, and they can again check the exam committee. We'd recommend they check that the exam committee members are correct in case they've forgotten to do that already by clicking the exam committee hyperlink, and also to check the view thesis icon just to make sure that the agreed version of the thesis has been uploaded. It's not uncommon for the wrong version of the thesis to be uploaded, or a draft version, for example. So supervisors take the time to check the view thesis and click the view thesis icon, and it'll download the PDF of the thesis just to double check that it is the one that you have both agreed on. If there's any issues with the thesis, the supervisor can click the reject button. Sometimes the student will realize straight away that they've uploaded the wrong thesis. And if that's happened, we tell them to contact their supervisor immediately. So the supervisor can go to this screen and hit the reject button, which will push it back a couple of steps for the student to be able to complete the task again. But if everything checks out here, the supervisor can click the approve button, which basically ends the thesis approval for examination phase. The supervisor has now approved it for examination by the exam committee. So this is the third section in the journey where the exam committee comes into it. So when the supervisor does that approval, an email is sent to all the members of the exam committee, and they'll be going into InfoHub and especially into My Exam Committee tasks to complete their various tasks throughout the project. They'll also be given their individual login details, like they'll have their own login details already if they're UCD staff, but externs will be given what's called a V number. So it's a V with 8 digits. So they'll be given those details to log in as well. There's also a reset password function on that page as well, if needed. One of the features for the exam committee members as part of the examination process is preliminary reports. So with the exception of for PhD programs will require, so just PhDs, not MDs, not research masters or professional doctorates, but PhDs will require at least one of the exam committee members to complete what's called a preliminary report form. I think everybody can avail of it, but the PhDs will need to require to get one done, and they'll go into the preliminary thesis report section, And if you're availing of the preliminary report, regardless of whether you're a PhD reviewer or not, you can go in and click Add Recommendation, and then that will take you to the preliminary report form, which is basically an online form outlining the summary, the strengths, the weaknesses of the thesis. So you'd be quite familiar with that from the joint degree report. So the purpose of the preliminary examination report forms is to allow for the individual exam committee members to generate their own feedback and opinions and research on the research without any bias or influence from their other colleagues. It's supposed to be their own initial thoughts and opinions on the work before they actually have a discussion or a review or an examination with the wider exam committee. So that's the feature, that's what the facility is for. Just to keep in mind as well, the chair, we would treat the chair as the coordinator of all of this. They're the manager of this whole examination process, and we would contact the chair in the first instance if there was any issues from our side, for example. But through the eThesis exam system, the chair of the examination committee will ensure that the preliminary reports from each examiner are exchanged amongst the members of the exam committee. So it's important to note that the exam committee members can't see each other's respective preliminary reports until after both of them have been submitted. It's just to keep that in mind. And that completes, like, if applicable, a viva voce is then completed separately from the system, depending on the program as well. That's in the round after the preliminary reports are done, and the student will meet with the exam committee members, as you know, and the viva voce is completed at that point in the eThesis journey, which then takes us on to the post-exam phase, where the exam committee completes the joint degree report and also gives the award recommendation. And if applicable, any revisions are completed, uploaded, and approved. So at this point, the chair can now complete the joint degree report form, which is also completed through our eThesis system. It functions very much like an online form, and most of you will be aware of the headings of the summary, the brief summary, the strengths, the limitations, and the corrections required perhaps as well. So you'd be quite familiar with that. But it's filled out online by the chair, but it's important to note that the chair fills it out on behalf of the entire exam committee member. So it's not to be written in the first person singular, for example. So it should never be, I think the work is this, or I believe the work is that. It should be, we believe the work is, or we think the work is that. It's supposed to be representative of the thoughts and feedback of the entire committee. So that's something to bear in mind. We'll often have to send those back to the exam committee members to revise them if we receive them, if they're written in the first person singular. But once the joint degree report form is completed, both the intern and the extern examiners must approve the joint degree report, which is the digital version of getting their signature as would have been done on the paper reports. They'll have received an automatic email saying that the chair has completed this joint degree report, and the interns and the externs can log in and then go to the approve final recommendation section, tick the box and click the sky blue approve button to show that they approve of the joint degree report. They can go to the final research degree report section and click where the red arrow down the bottom is and click view final if they want to double check what the chair has written, just to make sure that they approve of what's been discussed and what's been said. So there's, as I said, there's common troubleshooting problems with the joint degree report. As I said, the first person singular is quite a common issue that we get, where it's written in the first person singular, or that the characters limit box has been exceeded and that the answer is too big, for example. Or sometimes that, like, it's an award recommendation of no corrections has been given, but then there are corrections listed in the report itself. So there's a mismatch between the award recommendation and the corrections. So and that's the bytes counter link I was telling you about, where you can use that to copy and paste your answer in if you're using any unusual special characters or text, for example. So if the award recommendation is for revisions to the thesis, so depending on the situation, sometimes the student will be given revisions of some kind to complete. The chair of the exam committee will assign a member of the exam committee so a nominated member to work with the student and oversee the revisions. And the chair will introduce the exam committee member to the student, and this is when the student will be given a more detailed version of the corrections that they require. So once the student then goes off and completes the required revisions, they will be able to upload their corrected thesis, much in the same way that they've uploaded their initial thesis for examination. And once they successfully upload that from their side, the torch will be passed back over again to the exam committee member. All exam committee members will receive an automatic email at this point informing them that the reviewed thesis has been uploaded. Now, what's important to say here is that all exam committee members are emailed about this, but it is the individual responsibility of the assigned exam committee member to go on to the thesis corrections page and either approve or reject the corrections. So it's not the responsibility of the chair or their other exam committee colleagues. It's just for the assigned exam committee member, even though everyone will receive the email. So that's just an important piece to bear in mind as well. So that takes us to the end of the post-exam phase. And then this is where it'll end up on our reports in the ACCE report support team. Once all this, the first 4 phases of this journey are complete, and that's when we'll put the joint degree forward for review for the ACCE, assuming the report checks out in terms of writing in the first person singular, for example, or the word count. So when the previous steps, as I mentioned, have been completed, the joint degree report will become available for consideration at the next available ACCE meeting. So by that point, if it's a PhD, a preliminary report will have been successfully completed. The joint degree report will have been completed online as a group. A viva voce may have occurred as well, separate from the system at this point. The intern and the extern will also have approved the joint degree report online on our system. And if there are revisions required, the final revised corrected thesis will have been uploaded, and the assigned exam committee member will have approved those corrections. So then and only then will it appear in our list of final reports received, and then we'll be putting it forward to the ACC committee at the next available meeting for them to review and hopefully approve the award. So when the joint degree report, if and when it has been approved by the ACC, the student's record is updated to degree complete and pending award. An email is sent to all stakeholders involved, informing them of the outcome. And with permission from the student, the thesis is transferred to the open access research repository UCD, where it can be made freely available to anyone who requires it. If it's embargoed, as I said, before stage 1, and that conversation about the embargo and that application for the embargo happens, only brief bibliographic details of the thesis will appear on that repository database. The full text will only become available after the embargo expires. So that's a more detailed, fleshed out breakdown of the time to the journey for. I'll just allow you to digest that at your own pace once we hand around the slides at a later stage, but it's just a more fleshed out version of what I spoke about. And just to wrap up, to bring you to, I suppose, the suite of resources and tools that we've now developed to help you with this eThesis exam system journey. First and foremost, we have a dedicated email service for technical support regarding the eThesis. So that's eThesis@ucd.ie. So if you're seeing something on a screen that you don't think, or you feel you should be seeing something on a screen, it's not popping up for you, you're having trouble navigating the eThesis system, give us a shout on eThesis@ucd.ie. We'll do what we can to help you out. The usual ACCE@ucd.ie is also there as in terms of for ACC related queries. Not to mention, there's lots of other stakeholders and emails involved in this that can help you out along the journey as well. So you're not alone in this regard. We've also got a new section for the UCD assessment website called the eThesis examination system. And the eThesis implementation group, just before Christmas, we rolled out 4 FAQ pages and 3 guidebooks for the eThesis journey. They're all tailored and dedicated to each particular stakeholder. So there's a guidebook for the students, there's one for the supervisors and stakeholders, and there's one for the exam committee members. So You each have a guidebook from your own perspective as well, and that we hope you'll also find useful, not to mention the FAQ pages for those common troubleshooting issues you have. But if it's not coming up in the guidebooks or the FAQ pages, by all means, give us an email on eThesis@ucd.ie and we'll work to help you out. We're also developing some short instructional videos for key tasks during the journey to help out everyone from students, supervisors to exam committee members as well. So they should be up and running in the coming weeks as well. We'd also encourage you to click the links to these supplementary guides. I believe these supplementary guides should be open on your screen if and when you're doing anything to do with eThesis submission or examination. A lot of our guidebooks and our systems were built on the information that came from, for example, the academic regulations and the guidelines for prep, submission, examination, and dissemination of research degree thesis. So they're policy documents that we would encourage you to look up. They give you a good breakdown of what's expected of everybody in this process, whether with all the stakeholders, and it gives a good breakdown in bullet points of what you're expected to do as well. So we'd really encourage you to take a look at those supplementary guides alongside our own guidebooks as well. So yeah, that's the eThesis exam system in a nutshell. I'm going to hand it over now to my colleagues Mary and Fiona for the Q&A session.